So, theory of change. My favorite definition is that theory of change is a comprehensive description and illustration of how and why a desired change is expected to happen in a particular context. It is focused in particular on mapping or filling in what is called the missing middle. That is often the connective tissue between like what a program or change initiative does, its activities or its interventions, and how that actually is going to lead to that population level impact that a group has indicated that they're trying to achieve. I want to emphasize something really important about this, which is why is it called a theory? Because it's just a collection of our assumptions and hypotheses about how an MSP believes it can change a system. This is the thing I think becomes kind of critical in this work with theory of change and a situation of complexity, which is that it's just our current best thinking. And that's going to evolve the more we learn and the more we do and get feedback in the process. So just really want to encourage you to keep that in mind. I always like this slide about often in change initiatives, what you see is that people are like, we're going to do this thing, and then a miracle is going to occur, and then the world will be a better place. And what theory of change is trying to encourage us to do is bring some of our rigorous thinking, like our held assumptions, and make them visible about like what that miracle actually looks like. How do we think the change is actually going to happen? So how can a theory of change support a multi-sector partnership? A couple of key ways. The first of which is that it can help you articulate your thinking and assumptions, as I just alluded to, and really push you to think about like the activities that a group is proposing to do. Can they plausibly lead to the intended results that you're trying to achieve for the population, the community, the industry, whatever it is. It can help you identify pivot points. So whether there are things the MSP is doing that are not helping to transform that system, you can go back to those activities or to the assumptions on which they're built on and update them and revise them as you go and learn. It can help you distinguish what are collaborative activities, which activities and outcome specific partners can undertake on their own, like in their own organization, or that because they have some sort of formal or legitimate power, so like they control a policy or a regulation, versus what are actually collaborative activities that multiple partners need to be involved with. And it can help you determine milestones and indicators of how to measure your impact. One of the things that's interesting, I kid you not, I was having a conversation with a close friend on the phone yesterday while walking the dog. And we were talking about results-based accountability, which she's just been introducing into her organization, and that framework of performance versus population accountability. And one of the ahas I had was sort of theory of change is the way you're creating the description of how the performance accountability leads to the population accountability. And it was one of those things where I'm just like, wow, my life's so nerdy. This is what I talk to friends about on the phone while walking the dog. But also, I have to tell this to you guys today. So I wanted to make sure I shared that. So as you'll remember, if we go back to our Danella, we can't control the systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them, is that idea in Dancing with Systems, which we read back for the first residency of this class. And so what's powerful about theory change is that it's a tool to help us do that dancing with systems. When we're articulating our assumptions, when we're thinking this is what's going to lead to this result, it's a place that we can come back to. And as we're doing the dance and doing the work, then we go back and are like, ooh, that thing we thought isn't true. So let's shift the dance a little. We need to move 2 steps to the left as opposed to 1 to the right. To me, it's one of those tools that's really impactful in systemic change because it makes visible current thinking and forces us to articulate our assumptions. And this is a thing I come back to time and time again. Like everyone just holds a lot of this stuff in our heads, but when we make it shareable and accessible to other people that we're working with, that's the place where we're able to be like, okay, I get it. Let's stay connected. Let's think about this. So, what does developing a theory of change entail? And I will say this is like the ideal situation where a group of people come into it and they're like, yes, I got it. I know what's going on. But usually the first step in this is identifying a desired long-term goal, and then to work backward from these to identify all the conditions, sometimes referred to as outcomes, that must be in place, or that we think must be in place for that long-term goal to be achieved. And then these all get mapped out in an outcomes framework. So starting with the long-term goal. And then I would say the second thing is you almost build from the bread of the sandwich inwards. So identifying the actors and inputs who are and activities that they're bringing into the work. So like who's involved with the MSP, and what might happen as you explore this process is you realize, oh, maybe there's some people who haven't been involved that we need to bring in order to do this work as well. And what are they actually doing? This could include a program. This could include, in terms of your activities and input, certain expertise or funding they're bringing in to the process or create. And this can also be like what's already happening plus what you're creating through the MSP. So this could include a working group or research or those types of things as inputs. So as you think about these two ends, really, again, this is this notion of the missing middle. I like how I'm pointing at the screen. Of course, you can't see me pointing at the screen, so I just look like a nutty person on your screen who's pointing. But that missing middle is like what connects the activities and inputs that these actors are doing with this intended long-term result. And often people, and I think this is true, working backwards from the intended result to work out short-term and intermediate outcomes, if they exist, is often a really useful way to think through this because it keeps us grounded in what is the actual thing we're trying to achieve in the world to make happen, and not building from that sort of like, okay, this is what we're doing, what does it lead to? And then you have this chance to establish the links between outcomes in their order by working out causes and effects. In systems work, we likely need to hypothesize multiple relationships between cause and effect. So it's sometimes funny when you see theory of change in more programmatic work, it's often like very quite linear. And sometimes people are like, so what's the difference between this and a logic model? I think in systemic work, it tends to get a little messier because often in systemic work, we're not just talking about like one thing leads to one result. We're talking about, oh, we got to do multiple things simultaneously, or we're going to try multiple things in order to try and produce a different type of outcome. So the next piece of the puzzle with this is, okay, you've thought through what is sort of the causal or contributory links of different outcomes occurring. And then for each of these, you then can start to think about what will tell me that this has changed. What indicates that we've achieved this outcome, and what data could we actually collect relating to that? So I'm doing this interesting project with a group that does dance and martial arts. I think I've mentioned it in class before. And one of the things that is key is that while learning the skills of those things is important, the primary work of this organization is really about youth empowerment. And it's about they have said, I have it on my wall right now, young people live meaningful, connected and creative lives. That's what their intended result, long-term goal of all the work that they do is really about. And so one of the things that's been really interested is that when we've been talking about some of the developmental leaps that people experience as a result of like their dance classes or their martial arts training, in this, the way this program structures it, is it's really clear to the teachers when those shifts have happened for a student. And so we're actually starting from this process of like asking them what will indicate we've achieved this outcome, like what tells you when a student has, you know, made this shift in their development. And then we're trying to figure out how do we actually collect the data based on the teacher's own observations in those moments in a way that isn't like so difficult and overwhelming so that we can see sort of the trajectories and see different trajectories that students experience in that. So that's just to try and make it a little more concrete of like, it doesn't always have to be, you know, something that's like, oh, we'll do a survey or observation by people who are experienced in something and this is what they're thinking about intentionally, can also be a tool of recognizing a shift has occurred. I just wanted to name that. So the last but certainly not least thing that you have to do as part of the work of a theory of change is identify assumptions that are embedded within your approach. Because we always hold assumptions in our work, and that's you know, really critical for us to sort of recognize what some of them are. I often encourage when people are thinking about assumptions to look at two really kind of distinct sets of things. One is to look sort of into the culture and values of a group of people. So, you know, sometimes what you'll have is a team that's working together, and one of the values that's very closely held is like, ooh, we're trying to address this complex problem in the world. We will not take funding from a company that creates that complex problem in the world. You know, is I think about, you know, there was a lot of work that was done around like smoking cessation. And there were a lot of people who were really uncomfortable with taking money from companies that, you know, had a stake in this, in smoking industry or something like that. So that's one way of thinking about it. Then there's sort of like the world type of assumptions that we need to just have an awareness of. So I know there's lots of different labels for this. I always think of them as the steep forces. So social, technological, economic, environmental, and political. And, you know, when you think about that, if you were doing work in the education space 3 years ago, you had assumptions about the fact that like kids went to school every day, and you know, and then COVID-19 fundamentally shifted our understanding of how like education was being delivered for a period of time. You know, if you were doing work in contemporary Ukraine, you know, is there an awareness, or was there some sort of assumption of like there will be peace, or we have an assumption that there might actually be conflict again within our region? And just having those awareness and naming it within the work you're doing, especially in the context of complex work. So in terms of theory of change, it who and how should you develop and revise it? So I like to think of theory of change as a living document. It's one of those things that actually, you know, in my dream scenario, it's the type of thing where like every meeting that a group's doing on strategy or checking in on something like theory of change, people like have it out or with them or have it projected up. So they're like, ooh, how does this relate back and connect it? But I also want to name that like in the process of developing it, this notion of actively involving people who make up all parts of the system in doing this work, and learning and theorizing about applying it and reviewing and making meaning of results. So one of the big things that does happen often in evaluatory work, in learning work, is like it's either put to like one person, they're the one who's in charge of like knowledge or learning or evaluation. as opposed to making it part of the socialization and culture of a whole team of people who are working together. And the other thing is that it's only revisited like once a year. Whereas, what I would encourage is this idea of creating a rhythm and a schedule to keep testing, questioning, and revising your theory of change. And so that might be quarterly, or it might be, every half year, or it might be based on like, we're going to do a period of testing something. And when that test is sort of wrapping up, we're going to revisit the theory of change. And so that might be more tied less to a time frame and more to the specifics of a programmatic intervention or things like that. So a couple things to think about there. 4 tips for developing a theory change. Keep it as simple as you can. I need to remind myself of this constantly because I struggle with it. I want to like capture all the complexity everywhere, and that way lies madness. So especially as we're going to embark on playing a little bit around with theory of change in a bit, like I don't want you to try and be too ambitious or overwhelming as you play with it. When you're doing this out in the world, it's really valuable to circulate it to a wide degree of systems actors to get their feedback on if it's clear, help you spot any blind spots you might have with it. Increasingly the way I do this, like with organizations, is like there will be a core team, and then like we almost have concentric circles of like taking it out to more and more members of a group that are doing the work together and getting their feedback and taking that into how it's developed. As I noted, theory of change can be a living document. I think a lot of organizations still really treat it as like, we wrote it once and this is what we're sticking with. And that's another one where that way lies madness. If the whole idea is this is like hypotheses and assumptions that you have, and the work is testing that, then it should be something that's returned to and updated. And don't let the perfect be the enemy of the good with it. Like, this is your best thinking at this point in time. It's a little bit of a snapshot of work. And, our thinking improves by the more we do and the more we learn through it. I did want to just share 2 really different examples of theory of change. There are lots of them that are really different. There are forms of them that are visualizations. I actually just did one that was a narrative theory of change, which was an interesting experiment to try on with a group. But I'll show you 2 that actually both came out of Living Cities, but really different phases of the organization. So this is going back to around 2010. Living Cities had this funding initiative called the Integration Initiative. It was intended to support large-scale systemic change in urban environments. And the focus was on basically to support new ways of thinking and acting. So it was about systems change related to urban poverty in the United States. So there were 5 communities that were chosen that had initiatives that wanted to really transform a system. And it was developed to support new ways of thinking and acting across 3 different dimensions of the work. The first was issue areas. It really believed that like you could start with any issue area that was relevant to the issue of urban poverty, and as you were working to change that system, you were going to end up having to have impact on related systems to it. It wanted to have stakeholder groups that were creating greater alignment between philanthropy locally in the public sector and the private sector and nonprofits and community-based organizations. They also wanted the geographic boundaries to be either linking neighborhoods to cities and to regions. And the focus was really on achieving 4 different broad goals. One was this, like, I think we've talked about this in class, but they talked about a resilient civic infrastructure. So to build the relationship and connections among a group of people in a community, so that not only could they work to try and change this system, but potentially they would have built up some of their ability to work together for future challenges that their community might face. So they wanted to do that and also support people to move more from just programmatic interventions to more systemic intervention. They wanted to bring disruptive innovation, in particular around redirecting funds away from obsolete approaches and moving them towards things that actually were working. And they wanted to supplement traditional government and philanthropic funding streams by driving the private market to work on behalf of low-income people. So what Living Cities had was a membership that was made up of insurance companies and banks in addition to philanthropy. So it had gotten agreement among a bunch of them that were in the private sector to commit to making investments in the communities selected for this. So just to give you a sense of like, what did that actually look like as a theory of change? And if this is looking really small on your screen, I can also give you a link to it. Hold on. So it's on page 20 of this document, but this was the initial theory of change that they had. So their ultimate goal that's up here at the success or at the top was successful models are developed that can inspire a new generation of effective urban investment and transformation to the benefit of urban low-income residents. So what was interesting was that this was an initiative where the organization itself is on the right side. And this was where they were articulating, this is what we're trying to learn and test out as a funder. So it's interesting, Jen, I'm now thinking back to your question about like, do organizations evaluate themselves? And I'm like, oh, I guess this kind of was the way this place I worked was evaluating itself and its own ideas. And then on the left side was sort of their vision of what the work actually looked like for an individual community that was being funded by them. And this was sort of the timeline that they mapped out. As you can see, it lands a little bit linear, although you can also see the complexity, especially on the left side of there's some interesting loops and directions that arrows go along the way and sort of come out from the center line. I just wanted to share it with you so you could see this example, which is a pretty complex example. But at root, it's like at the bottom, you have this like, who are the actors and what are their inputs? And then it's showing you a chain of like what they think different types of outcomes in the short term, in the medium term, and in the long term within their time horizon, they expected it to be. It did evolve over time. It did get updated over time. But what's also interesting is that this organization, Living Cities, really changed its focus significantly over the next 11 or 12 years, and has started to explore more deeply issues of racial equity. And as it transformed that focus, it also did like a new organizational theory of change, which had like such a different energy to it that I really wanted to share it with all of you. And I'll also throw the link to this one. And it was funny because the first semester that I taught this class was when this was released. And I was just like, come on, what's the likelihood that there would be this beautiful convergence of it? But so they went from things like this that looked very kind of business-like and linear to then they moved to a model of theory of change that actually was done as this like artistic visualization. And I share this with you because I wanted to point out that theory of change can look a lot of different ways. It can embrace sort of the art, this use of narrative and storytelling around like seeds and plants, because they were really telling this story around racial equity and inclusion competency, and this idea about like, okay, you deepening it for individuals, and then like how are they going to do that to actually move from the individual to the organizational to the systemic change on this issue. I personally love this. I also am like, more art in the world, more non-traditional representations of things, but you also need to know, is like this the right format for a particular organization or context in which you are working?